Words hard. Welcome to episode number 5 of Manuscripting Pod, a show where I talk about writing, explore procrastination, and attempt to keep my inner critic hogtied and in the corner. In this episode, I'm talking about the phrase done is better than perfect and what it means to me. I just finished Austin Kleon's book, Show Your Work. It's basically a marketing or social media marketing book for artists and people who are visual creators of things. A lot of it is things that I've read before and heard before, but it's put in a different sort of way. It's really targeted towards people who work with visual things and also targeted towards social media and how to use social media as a visual art creator. I've read a lot of this information before, but it really resonated with me in the way that Kleon explores it and looks at it. So that's really cool. I'm also working my way through a couple of novels. One of them I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the show as a spotlight item. A lot of good stuff out now. The main topic is this phrase, done is better than perfect. I mean, if you follow me on Instagram or Twitter, I've been posting a lot of pictures of me rubber stamping my pocket notebooks with the phrase, done is better than perfect. I've had a couple of people kind of push back on that. Not really push back, but ask me, what does that mean? And my friend and coworker was like, explain this to me. What does that mean? And basically, for me, done is better than perfect is about sort of confronting my tendency towards perfectionism. I'm the sort of writer who would sit down and in terms of fiction writing, blog writing and reviews are entirely different, but that's a different beast, and I'll get into that in a second. I'm the type of writer who, with fiction, will sit down and I will write a sentence and then go back over it and rewrite it and tweak it and, oh, well, this word would be better. And I did this in a lot of my writing in undergrad, and when I was first starting out with my graduate work, I would just rewrite. And I get to a point where the sentence didn't mean anything to me anymore because I had written it so many times. And I hadn't gotten any further with the project because I was working on this one paragraph and tweaking it and reworking it and tweaking it and reworking it and never getting anywhere further with the paper. And I do that with fiction. I did it when I was writing when I was younger. And, I never finished anything because I just kept reworking stuff over and over and over again. And so done is better than perfect is really something that I got into when I first started my blog. I can't remember the actual first time that I heard it, but the most recent time that I was reminded of it and it resonated with me again is, I talked about this in the last podcast, Sarah Werner's podcast Right Now, which if you're not listening to as a fiction author, or as an author or writer in general, is something that you should go and start on episode 1 and just listen to it. It's really inspiring, and despite the fact that I don't agree with Werner on some things, I find what she has to say about writing and creativity very inspiring and useful, very useful, and her interviews are fabulous. So everyone should go and listen to Right Now, but she brought up that one of her coworkers would tell her, done is better than perfect. You have to get your copy out there at some point. You can't sit down and edit until something is perfect when you are getting copy out there. And in terms of like blogging, there came a point where I would, initially when I started, I would sit down and I would write a blog post. And this is back in the early days, back when I had my first blog, which I talked about over on the Pen Addict, about how it was chronicling my life as a queer woman living in a rural community and my breakup with my ex and the kind of drama that was just occurring. I mean, I can laugh about it now, but back then it was traumatic and it was difficult. And so I was chronicling this breakup via the blog and telling stories of what was happening in my life. So anyway, I would sit down and I would tell a story about what had happened that week with my ex or the crazy shenanigans my ex was engaging in. And God, she'd be mortified if she were hearing about this. But anyway, so I would write this story and then I would go back and I would edit and I would edit and I would edit. And it would be like midnight, and I'd say, I have to get this out. It's not perfect, but it's done. So I would publish it, and, my readers at the time would, come back and comment, and there were these conversations that I was having with people who lived in other rural areas, and what I was writing, I realized, was resonating with other people in similar situations. Many of them, were there because I was writing about this insanity in my life in a comedic manner. But anyway, like I started to understand that I couldn't spend all of my time editing, and sometimes done is better than perfect. I mean, basically, like with writing, you can sit down, you can edit, and you can edit for days on end, and it'll never be what you hope as perfect. And at some point, you have to say, this is done, and it's not perfect, but done is better than perfect. So anyway, you could do that. And for me, done is better than perfect is a reminder that I have to accept that at some point I have to put these things out into the world. It's like with art, it's different for me. I've been a visual artist since I was a teenager, and I've always gotten very good feedback on my visual art. But writing, which was something that I loved before visual art, was something I felt much less confident with. Whereas you put a brush in my hand or a pencil in my hand, and I feel very confident with that. But when it comes to words hard, right? Like, it's so hard to like get the right words out there. And at some point you have to just radically accept that this is the thought. This is how I am saying it. I've practiced a lot of radical acceptance with this podcast. Right now it's going particularly well, and my neighbors haven't started up their Harleys and started lapping the block, as they often do when I think about recording. Or, they'll decide to do construction on my street the moment I decide it's time to record. Sometimes I will just stop and I will erase, and then I will record again, and I will erase, and I will record again. And a lot of that is about my anxiety. And I'm not going to get into diagnoses and things here, but I have a lot of anxiety around talking, particularly when I'm talking to myself, like I am now, and putting a podcast out into the world. And so learning how to accept something as good enough without it being perfect has been a very difficult thing for me to master in a way. But going back to writing, sometimes what's the most expressive thing for me is just getting into the zone. When I get that zone of writing and the story is coming, and my word count is upping because, my fingers are flying over the keyboard, and I feel really good and the story just flows. There's this just mindfulness to it that is relaxing and calming and soothing. And that, to me, is really what writing fiction is all about. It's telling this story that only I can tell. No one else has the same story. I mean, I'm sure the story that I'm writing right now has been told before. I know of at least one author who's taken a similar premise and explored it fully and put out several novels, put out a whole series of novels, and it's been fabulous. But my premise is slightly different, and only I can tell it in the way that I can with the characters that I've created. Part of done is better than perfect is about moving forward. It's about always moving forward. It's about exploring the characters. It's about writing. It's about abandoning perfection or perfectionism and leaving behind my anxieties about what I'm writing. Also, the other thing is you can't edit a blank page. You can't open up a blank document and edit that. I have to have something there to edit. I have to have something there to work on. Without any words, there are no steps towards the eventual perfection that I will abandon and move away from. I think it was Anne Lamott that wrote about the crappy first draft. I'm keeping it PG. I know she didn't say crappy. She used the adult word for that. And I think that's something that we all need to revisit, because one of the things that a lot of published authors and even some of the self-published authors that I interact with talk about is the fact that what you end up publishing has a semblance to what you first write, but so much changes in the drafting and the first draft and the second draft after beta readers and sensitivity readers look at it and help you craft the actual story into something better. And all those edits make this novel better, tighter, and make it flow better than it even came out of me. And spending an hour working on just one sentence or just one paragraph doesn't get me anywhere. It doesn't take the story anywhere. It just leaves me feeling frustrated and aggravated with the story itself. The other thing is, once I started to embrace the idea of done is better than perfect, or this eventually must see the light of day. I mean, I have many, many novels and short stories and blog posts even that I have abandoned. I probably have, 50,000 to 100,000 words that I've just abandoned in Google Docs and in various hard drives, and who knows how many I've lost over the years. How many papers have I just abandoned, or how many ideas have I abandoned? How many God, the number of journals that I have that are just sitting on a shelf down in my studio is astounding. I mean, there are 40 of them, 30, 35, 40 since I last counted them. And then, I've got 90 pocket notebooks that I've filled with my gibberish. At some point that has to, I either have to, as my grandmother would have said, take a dump or get off the pot. You have to decide, what are you going to do with this information? What are you going to do with these ideas? Am I going to publish some of this stuff, or am I just going to sit on it for the rest of my life? I'm going back to my life as a visual artist. One of the things that I decided very early on with all of my artistic endeavors is that it has to be self-sustaining. So when I first started Comfortable Shoes Studio, and when I first started making the very expensive journals that I make, the leather-bound journals, the hand-bound stuff, one of my rules was that it had to be self-sustaining and that I couldn't store it. I lived in a number of tiny apartments when I was younger, and I couldn't have vast stores, or I didn't even have room for a studio. In one apartment I lived in, I had these 2 4-foot by, I think they were 6 shelves each, the kind of crappy metal shelving that you buy for your garage. I had 2 of those that I spray painted blue and purple. They were fabulous. They were. And that was my studio. I had all of my art materials had to fit on those shelves. That was the rule. And anything that I made had to go out. I was just accumulating all of this stuff. And initially I wasn't. I was accumulating all of this stuff. My roommate was like, what are you going to do with all of this crap, Leslie? You make art, and then you put it on your shelf. What are you going to do with it? And that was in the early days of eBay. I just started putting stuff on eBay, and there's a thrill to selling your artwork. And I'm sure at some point, I've dabbled with some freelance work in terms of writing and writing copy for other people's blogs and for websites. And there's a thrill to selling your artwork, to packaging it up and sending it off to someone and getting a message from them and saying, I loved this. And I'm sure that I will feel the same way once I get to a point with my writing that I did with my artwork. There was a point with my artwork where it was like, I either have to sell this or I have to throw it away because I have no more storage and I have a tiny car. I can't, if I move to another apartment, can't afford a U-Haul. I can't transport it with me. So I had this rule that any artwork that I made had to be self-sustaining. I couldn't just store it. I needed to sell it. I needed to push it and move it on with its life. And I think done is better than perfect. Also, in terms of writing, keeps me from having writer's block, because if I'm sitting down, I'm showing up to the table, to my tablet every day, or almost every day, 5 out of 7 days, then I'm not thinking about having writer's block. I'm looking at my outline. I'm saying, okay, I'm working on this scene today, and I'm writing. And that has been really good. There have been a number of times where I've been like, oh man, I don't want to get out of bed. I just want to roll over and get another 30 minutes of sleep. But I drag my butt out of bed, I make my coffee, and I sit down and I write. And it's freeing. It's liberating. I don't know. I think done is better than perfect is a really good mantra for trying to get past writer's block or to not have it. Writer's block this is my sort of philosophy or thought around it in terms of psychology. Writer's block is anxiety. It's a manifestation of my anxiety as a writer. And not that I've ever had it. I've always been able to sit down at my computer and bang out a review. Writing reviews is easy for me. I've been doing it for so long. It's been almost 20 15 years? 15 years that I've been writing reviews and writing, educational information about art. And I have no block with that. That's a very, technical writing and review writing is a very different sort of writing. But it's still, I've heard of other people being very stressed out, very anxious. They won't call it anxiety, but what they're expressing is anxiety, maybe not in a subclinical sense. Writer's block in some forms, and for some people it is, I would say, at clinical levels, is anxiety. But that is a whole other podcast that we can talk about. So in terms of the spotlight, beta reading, as well as assisting authors in getting therapy right in their books, acting sort of as a expert, acting as somewhat of an expert in terms of what therapy is, and giving an opinion and some advice on how to get therapy right in terms of writing and how do you write it properly in terms of a book. So it's been really interesting to read some of these early chapters, early sections, and early drafts, very first drafts of novels, and see what authors think therapy is and is not, and also to have a conversation about ethics and ethical boundaries and things that go along with being a therapist and a social worker. I'm not a social worker, but I work in a clinic with them. But anyway, so that's, and then there's another book, which I don't feel like I'm at liberty to really discuss, but it dealt with substance abuse. And for anyone who follows me on Twitter, I work with a dual diagnosis population in my day job. So I work with people who have usually one or several major mental health diagnoses, and often a secondary diagnosis in some sort of substance abuse. So having a conversation with people about what is considered the right sort of therapy for people with substance abuse and what the typical round of treatment is has been really, really interesting in seeing what people think it is and what it actually is now and what is considered a best practice in the field. Anyway, so if anyone needs a beta reader or sensitivity reader, wants to ask for expert opinion around what therapy is and is not, I'm always happy to do a beta read and give you some opinions about what does and does not happen. And if you just want to hit me up on Twitter, ask me some questions about what happens in therapy, what happens in a partial hospital program, I'm happy to give that information as myself and not as a representative for the company that I work for. So that is an important thing for you to know. I don't represent my company when I do these things. All right, the check-in. I have just finished my 4th week of writing 5 out of 7 days. And for this 4th week, I've actually written 7 out of 7. Usually I've been getting 6 out of 7, give myself 1 day off. This week I've done 7 of 7. I feel really good about that. There have been a couple of days where I've gotten up extra early because my schedule varies a little bit. On Wednesdays I go in later and Thursdays I go in later. So I get up at the same time every day. And on those days I usually have 45 minutes that I can write. So sometimes I'm getting a little extra writing time on those days, but I'm averaging 600 words a day. I've had several days this past week where I've had some really emotional dialogue between my 2 main characters. And it's been a little slower going than usual, but it's been really good. And I just, today actually, I just did a plot twist that really emotionally impacted my 2 main characters. And it's going to cause a bad decision in the next couple of scenes that is going to push the rest of the story forward and make the main character engage in some really crappy behavior that's going to be really fabulous to write. But anyway, so that's the check-in. I'm now at over 33,000 words in the novel, and I'm looking at probably being around 80,000 by the end of NaNoWriMo. I'm going to break NaNoWriMo rules and work on this during Nano, and by the end of NaNoWriMo, I'm probably going to have it more than finished. I'll probably be ready to start edits. So anyway, I'm really excited about where this novel's going. I'm at a good place in the novel, the middle slog. I'm getting into that, but the bad decisions this character is going to make are going to be great for the story. So anyway, that's my check-in. So 5 of 7 is going really well. I did not expect it to be going this well. I'm really happy with where I'm at. All right, so I want to do some shout outs this week. I have gotten so much amazing feedback from people who have just started listening to the podcast or who have found it through various Slack channels or through Twitter or wherever they found it from. It's been really cool to get some feedback about the podcast. So Harry Marks of the Covered Podcast also runs the Salon Writers Slack group, has been really supportive via Instagram and via PM about listening to the podcast and giving me support, particularly around my photos on Instagram about writing. So that has been, I just really appreciate that. I think it's one of the things that we can do as authors is, go to the Am Writing hashtag on Instagram, find an author and say, way to go. I love watching your word count climb. So that has been really fabulous for me. Stuart of Nero's Notes and the 1857 podcast, which is a fabulous podcast about stationery and all things stationery related. So that includes time management and the arts and writing and all of that fun stuff. So he just started listening. I'm really, horrible at this self-promo thing, but I swear that he and TJ on 1857 are in my head, or if not on the same wavelength as I am. Literally, like I do a podcast about something, or I have one in the works, I'm thinking about one, or we do one on RSVP, and they have the same subject. So that's really cool. I just really enjoy it. Speaking about Harry Marks's Slack channel, the Salon, Justin PM'd me, and thank you so much for affirming that I'm getting the tone of the show right. Everything that you mentioned in that PM is exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking to be a little vulnerable. I'm looking to keep myself on track. And I hope that being vulnerable and keeping myself on track helps others also explore their writing and keep putting their stories out there. I mean, we're the only people who can write our stories. No one else can write them, and I want to read them, and I want to know about them. So, fabulous. I'm also, I hope, Justin, that implementing the 5 of 7 rule helps to keep you as motivated and works as well as it has been for me. I also want to thank Brad over on the Pen Addict for the shout out. Thank you so much. If you're here from the Pen Addict, welcome. I don't handwrite my entire novels anymore. I do the first time when I have an idea for a story, what I do is I open up a composition notebook. If you want to find out the good ones for fountain pens, head over to comfortableshoesstudio.com and search it for my reviews on composition notebooks. I do a fresh batch every back to school season and test out everything from fountain pens to gel pens to pencils and figure out what works best. But anyway, so the first thing I do now is I crack out a composition notebook, write down the idea that I have, and then start thinking about characters and plot and all of those things. I do a detailed page for each character, and then I go through the plot. Each plot beat or each beat of the story gets a page. And it's very brief. It's usually just a sentence or two. Sometimes I explore it a little more fully because sometimes each beat gets a little more involved as I think about the story. So anyway, that's how I use notebooks and pens and paper now. And I like to use my really fancy inks in a composition notebook. So like I get out those Robert Oster inks and the Organic Studio Walden and the stuff that sheens and the glittery, shimmery inks. I love those for writing out my first ideas for a story. So that's really fun. Unfortunately, I can't write out my novels by hand anymore due to carpal tunnel. I write all day at my day job, and by the end of the day, my hand is like a claw. I'm working my way to probably having to have some surgery. I'm pushing that out of my head, and I'm in denial right now over it. So finally, if you want to show some support for the show, head on over to your favorite location and leave a review. If you've left a review or maybe you just don't want to engage with Apple, that's all cool. Share the show on your favorite or least favorite social media location. Anytime you talk about the show or you put a tweet up about it or suggest it to someone, more people see that than usually just the only person that you're suggesting it to. And it's really the best way that you can show your support for your favorite podcast is to give us a shout out on social media. Reviews on Apple are fabulous. It does, boost the rank for the show in their podcast stuff. But I love reading tweets where I'm tagged or you've done a hashtag for the show. I've been using hashtag manuscriptingpod or hashtag manupod to tag everything that I write about the show. So if you want to tag me, you want to tag the show, I'd love to hear what you have to say, suggestions, questions, anything like that. You can also head on over to Ko-fi. I have a page on Ko-fi. I'll link it in the show notes. You can find me on most social media at Original LC Harper. I'm on Instagram as Original LC Harper. I'm also on Twitter as Original LC Harper. And Manuscripting Pod actually has its own little Facebook page. About 100 people. It's really supportive. We post about, how many words we've gotten that day, if we're writing that day, what we're doing in terms of writing. Some people are working on outlines or plot bunnies and things like that. So the Manuscripting Pod Facebook page is quiet, but it's so supportive. So anyway, those are the places you can find me. You can support the podcast. I really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for listening.